107 tractors showed up at the Leland Messer farm on a Sunday morning in Boone County, Iowa, and not a single one of them was there to plow. They were there to block a road. They were there to tell 3 men in dark suits that this sale was not going to happen the way those men thought it would. But 48 hours earlier, Leland Messer didn't know any of that was coming. 48 hours earlier, Leland Messer was sitting at his kitchen table with a single sheet of paper in front of him, a letter from Consolidated Farm Credit out of Des Moines, and his hands were shaking so badly his wife had to read it to him. The letter said the bank was calling his note, all of it, $67,400, due in full by the following Monday. If he could not pay, and the bank knew he could not pay, the property would be sold at a sheriff's auction on Sunday, March 11, 1984. The farm, the house, the outbuildings, the equipment, everything his grandfather had put into the ground since 1921. Leland owed the money. That was not in dispute. He'd borrowed $42,000 in the spring of 1981 to put in 200 acres of corn and 60 of soybeans, and the rates had been reasonable then, 9.25% on a 5-year term. But by the time the corn came in, the price had dropped from $3.40 a bushel to $2.28. He sold everything he had, and still came up short. The next year was worse. The year after that, interest rates climbed to 14% on the restructured note, and Leland was paying more each month just to service the debt than his father had paid for the entire farm in 1952. He was not alone. In 1984, across the state of Iowa, 12,000 farms were in some stage of foreclosure. 12,000 families getting letters, just like the one Leland held in his shaking hands. The farm crisis of the 1980s didn't arrive like a tornado. It arrived like a slow leak in a basement wall. You didn't notice until the foundation was already cracked. Federal grain embargoes against the Soviet Union in 1980 collapsed the export market overnight. Prices that had been climbing for a decade reversed. Farmers who had borrowed against inflated land values in the late 70s, land the banks had told them would only go up, suddenly owed more than anything they owned was worth. The banks had written the loans. The banks had appraised the land. The banks had said yes, and now the banks wanted out. Leland's father, Warren Messer, had bought the farm in 1952 for $22,000, cash, no mortgage. He'd worked the ground for 30 years with a set of equipment that fit in a single shed. A Farmel M, a 2-bottom plow, a pull-type combine he'd bought used from a man in Hamilton County. Warren never borrowed a dollar. He never carried a balance. And when he handed the farm to Leland in 1979, the land was free and clear. It was the bank that came to Leland, not the other way around. A loan officer named Rick DeVore drove out to the farm in the spring of 1981 and sat at the kitchen table, the same table Leland was sitting at now, and told him that with 260 acres of prime Boone County ground, he was sitting on a gold mine. "You could expand," Rick said. "Put in all 260 in corn, hire a custom cutter, finance the inputs at 9.25, and by October you'd clear 40,000. Easy." Leland didn't want to expand. Carol was the one who said they should listen. She didn't know. Neither of them knew. But the letter that arrived at the Messer farm on a Friday afternoon in March had something different about it. It had a date that was 48 hours away. Not 30 days. Not 2 weeks. 48 hours. The bank wanted this done fast, before anyone could organize, before anyone could call a lawyer, before the neighbors found out. They wanted it done while Carol was in the hospital, and Leland was alone, and the house was empty, and nobody was watching. The bank did not account for Darlene Kurtz. Darlene Kurtz was 53 years old. She had worked at Consolidated Farm Credit for 19 years, starting as a typist in 1965 and working her way up to senior administrative assistant, which meant she opened the mail, typed the letters, and knew every single loan file in that building better than the men whose names were on the doors. She had typed foreclosure letters before, dozens of them. She typed them, and she filed them, and she went home, and she didn't sleep. But she typed them. That was her job. But the Messer letter was different. Darlene knew Leland. Not well. Not socially. She knew him the way you know someone from church, from the co-op, from standing behind them at the farm and fleet in Ames. She knew his wife, Carol, had been fighting breast cancer since the previous fall. She knew his daughter was 16 and had been driving the grain truck since she was 14 because Leland couldn't afford to hire help. She knew these things because Boone County is 900 square miles and 25,000 people. And in a place like that, you know. What she also knew, what the 3 vice presidents who signed that letter did not bother to know, was that Leland had never missed a payment. Not once. He'd been late twice, both times by less than a week, and both times he'd called ahead. The bank was calling his note not because he'd defaulted, but because the collateral, his land, was worth more than the loan. Farmland in Boone County was appraised at $1,400 an acre. Leland's 260 acres were worth $364,000 on paper. The bank wanted the land. The bank did not want Leland. Now, I need to stop here and explain something, because without this, the rest doesn't make sense. In 1933, during the first great wave of farm foreclosures, farmers in Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and the Dakotas invented something called the penny auction. Here's how it worked. When a farm went to sheriff's sale, the neighbors showed up. All of them. They filled the yard, the road, the ditches. And when the auctioneer opened the bidding, one farmer would bid a nickel. Another would bid a dime. And that was it. Nobody else bid. If an outsider tried to bid, a speculator, a banker's agent, someone from the city looking to pick up 300 acres for 50 cents on the dollar, the farmers would surround him. They wouldn't touch him. They didn't have to. 40 men standing shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, not saying a word. The message was clear. You are not bidding on this farm. The auction would close. The farm would sell for a quarter, maybe $1. The buyer, always a neighbor, always prearranged, would hand the deed back to the original owner. The bank got its quarter. The farmer kept his land. It was technically legal. The auction was public. The bidding was open. Nobody committed fraud. Nobody committed violence. They simply showed up in numbers that made opposition unthinkable. The law said the property had to be sold to the highest bidder. The farmers made sure the highest bidder was one of their own. By the 1940s, the crisis had passed, and penny auctions faded into folklore. Grandparents told grandchildren about the time 40 men saved the Henderson place with a bid of 11 cents. It became legend. It became a story. In 1984, it became real again. Darlene Kurtz left the office that Friday at 5:15. By 5:40, she was on the phone with her brother, Dale, who farmed 700 acres in the northwest corner of the county. Dale called his neighbor, Wayne Pickering. Wayne called Tom Schott, who ran the Farm Bureau chapter. Tom called 6 men. Each of those 6 called 6 more. By 9 o'clock Friday night, 31 farmers knew that Leland Messer's farm was going to auction in less than 2 days. And every single one of them knew what a penny auction was, because every single one of them had heard the stories from their grandfathers. Here's what nobody standing in that phone chain knew. They didn't know if it would work. The 1930s were 50 years gone. The legal landscape had changed. Sheriff's auctions in 1984 had minimum bid requirements in some counties. They had reserve prices. They had judges who could void a sale if the price was deemed unconscionably low. And they had something the 1930s didn't have: corporate farm buyers with lawyers on retainer who could file injunctions before the gavel hit the block. But Tom Schott knew something the lawyers didn't. Tom was 61 years old, retired from active farming but still carrying his Farm Bureau card and still attending every county board meeting. Tom had read the Iowa Code. All of it. Not the summaries, not the pamphlets. The actual code, Title 10, Chapter 654, which governed mortgage foreclosure procedures in the state. And buried in Section 654.6, in language that hadn't been amended since 1939, was a single paragraph that said, "A foreclosure sale conducted without proper public notice," defined as publication in a newspaper of general circulation in the county at least 20 days prior to the sale, was voidable at the request of any interested party. 20 days. The bank had given Leland 48 hours. Tom drove to the Boone County Courthouse at 7 o'clock Saturday morning. The recorder's office was closed, but Tom knew Janet Foss, the deputy recorder, because he'd served on the county zoning board with her husband for 11 years. Janet met him at the side door. They pulled the file. There was no publication, no notice in the Boone County Shopper, no notice in the Ames Tribune, no notice anywhere. The bank had skipped the notice because the bank was in a hurry, and the bank was in a hurry because the bank knew that if Leland's neighbors found out, they would do exactly what they were doing right now. Tom made 3 photocopies. He put one in his truck. He gave one to Janet. He mailed one to himself at his own address, so there would be a postmark. That small detail, remember it. By Saturday afternoon, the phone chain had grown from 31 farmers to 64. By Saturday evening, it was 89. Wives were calling wives. Sons were calling cousins. A farmer from Story County, 20 miles away, heard about it at the feed store and called Tom to ask if they needed more trucks. Tom said, "Bring everything you've got." There's a sound a small town makes when it decides to move. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's the sound of engines starting in barns at 4 in the morning. It's trailer hitches clanging in the dark. It's diesel pumps running at the co-op on a Saturday night when the co-op is supposed to be closed, because Kenny Halverson, who managed the fuel station, opened it up and told every farmer who pulled in that night was on the house. He pumped 412 gallons of diesel that night. He wrote it off as a system error. Nobody questioned it. There's another sound, too. The sound of men who don't talk much on the phone suddenly talking. Wayne Pickering called his brother-in-law in Webster County, a man he hadn't spoken to in 2 years over a fence line dispute. "I need you here Sunday morning," Wayne said. "Bring your Oliver." His brother-in-law didn't ask why. He didn't ask about the fence. He said, "What time?" Wayne said, "Before dawn." The brother-in-law said, "I'll be there." That was the entire conversation. 13 words and a 2-year silence. Broken. The plan was simple. They would line every tractor they could muster along the half-mile of gravel road that led from County Road E57 to Leland's front gate. They would park them nose to tail, engines running, so close together that nothing wider than a man on foot could get through. They would block the road. If the sheriff came, they would hand him the photocopy of the code and ask him to read Section 654.6. If the auctioneer came, they would stand in front of him and tell him there was no legal auction to conduct. And if the bankers came, which they would, because bankers always come when there's money on the ground, they would look at 100 tractors idling in the mud and understand that this was not a farm they were going to take. Not today. There's something I haven't told you yet. Leland didn't know any of this was happening. Carol had been at the hospital in Des Moines since Thursday for her third round of chemotherapy. Leland had driven down Friday morning and hadn't come back. His daughter Jessie was staying with an aunt in Ogden. The house was empty. The farm was dark. And while 70, 80, 90 farmers were making phone calls and checking oil levels and loading trailers, Leland Messer was sitting in a plastic chair in a hospital corridor, holding his wife's hand while she slept, trying to figure out how to tell her they had lost the farm. He found out at 4 a.m. on Sunday. Tom Schott called the hospital and asked the nurses' station to find him. Leland came to the phone thinking someone had died. Tom told him to get in his truck and drive home. Tom told him not to worry. Tom said, "Just come home, Leland. Trust me. Just come home." Leland pulled into his driveway at 6:45 in the morning and could not get to his own house. The road was full, both sides. Tractors parked on the shoulders, in the ditches, in the field entrance, across the mouth of the driveway. Farmals, John Deeres, Olivers, Masseys, Alice Chalmers, machines from the 1940s, the 50s, the 60s, a few from the 70s, machines that had been sitting in sheds, machines that had been parked in fence rows, machines that hadn't turned over in years but had been dragged out and jump-started and driven through the dark to be here by sunrise. A 1952 Oliver 88 that had been used as a fence anchor for 6 years, pulled free and running. A Massey Harris pony so small it looked like a toy next to the big row crops, but it was there, engine turning, taking up its piece of the road. A pair of John Deere 4020s that had come 23 miles on the highway in the dark, running with their lights on, and the farmer who drove the lead one said later that when he came over the hill on E57 and saw the line of headlights already stretching down to Leland's gate, he had to pull over for a minute because he couldn't see the road clearly. The air was thick with diesel smoke, blue-gray in the early light. And the sound, I want you to hear this. The sound was 100 engines idling at once. A low, collective rumble that you didn't hear so much as feel in your chest, like standing near a river that was about to flood. Each engine had its own voice. The old farmalls had that offbeat 4-cylinder knock, like a heartbeat with a skip in it. The Deeres had the 2-cylinder thump, slow and heavy. The Olivers purred. The Masseys clattered. Individually, each one was just an old tractor running in a field. Together, they were something else entirely. Together, they were a sound that said, "We are not leaving." Leland parked on the county road and walked in. Men he hadn't talked to in years nodded at him. Men he'd never met shook his hand. Nobody said much. There wasn't much to say. They were here. That was the statement. The first tractor in line, parked directly across the gate, was a 1948 Farmall H, faded red, with a line from Proverbs hand-painted in white on the hood. It belonged to Dale Kurtz, Darlene's brother. The paint on those words was still wet. He'd done it that morning in his barn with a 1/4-inch brush before driving over in the dark. The bankers arrived at 8:15 in a black Lincoln Town car. 3 men. 2 from Consolidated Farm Credit. 1 from a firm in Des Moines that handled liquidations. They wore suits. They carried briefcases. They turned off the county road and stopped. The road was a wall of iron and smoke. They sat in the car for 11 minutes. Nobody went to them. Nobody yelled. Nobody made a gesture. 107 farmers stood in the mud with their arms crossed and their engines running and said absolutely nothing. The silence, the human silence, under all those engines, was the loudest thing in that county that morning. Let me slow down here, because this is the part that matters. At 8:26, the passenger door of the Lincoln opened, and a man in a gray suit stepped out. This was Gerald Fenn, Senior Vice President of Commercial Lending. Gerald was 44 years old. He'd been with the bank for 16 years. He had personally signed the acceleration letter on Leland's note. He was the one who'd ordered the expedited timeline. He was the one who'd decided 48 hours was enough. Gerald walked forward about 20 feet and stopped. He was looking at the Farmal H with the scripture on the hood. He was looking at Dale Kurtz, who was leaning against the front wheel with a thermos of coffee and a face that said he'd been up since 3 o'clock in the morning and had no intention of leaving before dark. Gerald said, "This is a legal proceeding. You're obstructing a lawful auction." Tom Schott stepped forward. He was wearing the same canvas jacket he wore to every Farm Bureau meeting, the one with the coffee stain on the left pocket. He didn't raise his voice. He handed Gerald the photocopy. "Section 654-6, Tom said. "No publication, no notice, no sale." Gerald looked at the paper. He looked at Tom. He looked past Tom at the rows of tractors stretching back down the road. Engines turning over, smoke rising into a sky that was getting darker by the minute because a spring storm was coming in from the west, the kind that smells like wet iron and makes the dogs go under the porch. "This isn't over," Gerald said. "I imagine it isn't," Tom said. "But it isn't happening today." Gerald walked back to the car. He didn't look at the farmers. He didn't look at the tractors. He looked at the ground, the mud on his shoes, the gravel that had gotten into the cuffs of his suit pants. He opened the car door and stopped. For maybe 2 seconds, he stood there with his hand on the frame, facing away from everyone, and nobody could see his face. Then he got in and closed the door. The 3 men sat there for another 7 minutes. You could see them talking through the windshield, but you couldn't hear what they said. One of them, the liquidation man, was on a car phone, the big kind with the coiled cord, talking to someone, probably a lawyer, probably hearing what Tom Schott already knew. Then the Lincoln backed up, turned around on the county road, and drove east toward Des Moines. Nobody cheered. I want you to understand that. Nobody cheered. A few men shook hands. A few nodded. One farmer, the brother-in-law from Webster County, the one who hadn't spoken to Wayne Pickering in 2 years, walked over to Wayne, and the two of them stood side by side and watched the Lincoln disappear, and the brother-in-law said, "That fence still needs fixing." Wayne said, "I know it." And the brother-in-law said, "I'll come by Thursday." That was how they settled it. Not with an apology. Not with a conversation about feelings. With a fence. Leland was standing by the gate with tears running into his beard and his fists clenched, and he could not speak. Dale Kurtz poured him a cup of coffee from the thermos and handed it to him and said, "Carol's going to be mad she missed this." And that was the closest anyone came to a celebration. The engines ran for another 2 hours. Nobody moved. Nobody left early. At 10:15, Tom walked the line and told every driver the bankers were gone, and the road was clear. They left one at a time, pulling out slow, giving a nod or a wave as they passed the gate. It took 40 minutes for the road to clear. The last tractor out was the Farmal H. Dale sat on that seat until every other machine was gone. Then he put it in gear and drove home. But it was not over. Tom knew that. The bank would come back with proper notice. The bank would publish. The bank would wait 20 days and file again. The law was on the bank's side in every way, except the one Tom had found, and that one was a delay, not a solution. This is where the story turns, and it turns on something so small you'd miss it if I didn't point it out. That letter Tom mailed to himself, the photocopy with the postmark, arrived at his house on Tuesday. He didn't open it. He put it in his filing cabinet in the sealed envelope, postmarked Saturday, March 10th, 1984. Proof that the bank had attempted to conduct a sale without the required 20-day notice. That postmarked envelope was not just proof. It was a cause of action. Tom drove to Ames on Wednesday and walked into the office of a lawyer named Margaret Chen. Margaret was 36, 2 years out of Drake University Law School, working alone in a 2-room office above a hardware store. She had 14 clients, most of them farmers. She had been looking for a test case, a case where a bank had violated the notice requirement so clearly, so provably, that a judge would have no choice but to rule on it. Not just void the sale, void the acceleration, return the loan to its original terms. Margaret looked at Tom's photocopy. She looked at the postmarked envelope. She looked at the Boone County Recorder's file that showed no publication whatsoever. And she said 4 words that changed Leland Messer's life. They gave us everything. Here's what Margaret understood that the bankers didn't. Iowa Code, Section 654.6, didn't just require notice for the sale. It required notice before the bank could legally accelerate the loan, call the full amount due. The acceleration letter itself was the trigger, and the acceleration could only happen after a specific sequence. Written notice of default, a 30-day cure period, and then, only then, if the borrower failed to cure, the bank could accelerate. Consolidated Farm Credit had skipped the cure period entirely. They'd gone straight from "you owe us" to "pay everything now." In one letter, mailed on a Friday, demanding payment by Monday. The cure period wasn't optional. It wasn't a courtesy. It was statutory. 30 days. Written in the code since 1939, tested in court twice in the 1940s, upheld both times, and then forgotten for 4 decades because the banks had always followed it. Until they stopped. Until the crisis made them greedy or desperate or both, and they started cutting corners because they thought nobody was reading the code. Margaret was reading the code. She spent 3 days building the filing. She pulled every comparable case she could find. Kelderman v. First Federal in 1943, Hospers v. Iowa Farm Mortgage in 1946, both cases where courts had voided accelerations for procedural failures. She documented the timeline down to the hour. The loan origination date. Every payment Leland had made. The acceleration letter dated Friday, March 9th. The auction scheduled for Sunday, March 11th. 48 hours. No default notice. No cure period. No publication. 3 separate violations of 3 separate statutory requirements, any one of which would have been enough to void the sale. But Margaret didn't just want to void the sale. Voiding the sale would only delay the inevitable. The bank would fix the paperwork and come back in 60 days. Margaret wanted to void the acceleration, return the loan to its original terms, force the bank to honor the deal it had made. And she wanted it on the record. Margaret filed in Boone County District Court on Thursday, March 15th. She named Consolidated Farm Credit, Gerald Fenn personally, and the liquidation firm. She asked for a declaratory judgment voiding the acceleration, an injunction preventing further foreclosure attempts, and, this is the part that mattered to every other farmer in the county, she asked the court to establish that any bank that skipped the mandatory cure period forfeited the right to accelerate. Period. Not just for Leland. For anyone. Have you ever held on to something everyone told you to throw away? Leland held on to that farm. He held on to a 9.25% loan that the bank wanted to turn into a $364,000 land grab. He held on because a secretary made a phone call, and a retired farmer read a statute, and a young lawyer in a 2-room office understood what she was looking at. The bank settled in 9 days. 9 days. No trial, no hearing, no deposition. Consolidated Farm Credit's attorneys looked at the statute, looked at their own file, looked at the photocopy Tom had mailed to himself with the postmark that proved the timeline, and they folded. They reinstated Leland's original loan. They reduced the principal by $11,000 as a concession. They agreed to a 5-year extension, and they signed a consent decree that said they would comply with Section 654.6 in all future foreclosure proceedings in the state of Iowa. That postmarked envelope, the one Tom sealed on Saturday morning and dropped in the mailbox outside the Boone County Courthouse, it cost him 20 cents. A single stamp. And it became the most important piece of evidence in the case, because it proved, with a federal postmark, that the bank's file had no publication notice as of March 10th, one day before the scheduled sale. The bank's attorneys couldn't argue that the notice had been published and lost. They couldn't argue it was pending. They couldn't argue anything. 20 cents and a federal postmark. And the entire acceleration collapsed. The consent decree was public record. Margaret made sure of that. She filed it with the Boone County Recorder, the same office where Tom had pulled the original file. She also filed it with the Iowa Secretary of State's office and sent copies to the Iowa State Bar Association. Within 2 weeks, every Farm Bureau chapter in Iowa had a copy. Within a month, attorneys in Minnesota, Nebraska, Illinois, and Missouri were citing it in their own foreclosure defense cases. A legal aid office in Omaha used it as a template to challenge 47 accelerations in a single filing. A law professor at the University of Iowa assigned it as a case study in his agricultural law seminar. Within a year, Consolidated Farm Credit had settled 14 more cases on similar terms. The bank did not take a single farm in Boone County in 1984 or 1985. The ripple went further than anyone expected. In 1986, the Iowa State Legislature amended the foreclosure code to add an explicit mandatory mediation step before any farm property could be sold at auction. The bill's sponsor, a state senator from Hardin County, cited the Messer case by name on the floor of the chamber. He said that when a bank can call a man's entire life due in 48 hours without following its own rules, the law has failed the people it was written to protect. The mediation requirement is still on the books today. Gerald Fenn transferred to the bank's commercial real estate division in Kansas City in the fall of 1984. He never handled a farm loan again. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge what had happened. He simply left. The office in Des Moines reassigned his files, and his name stopped appearing on letters. Rick DeVore, the loan officer who'd sat at Leland's kitchen table in 1981 and told him to borrow, left the bank entirely in 1985. He sold insurance in Ankeny for the next 20 years. If he ever thought about the loan he'd written, he never said so. That was enough. Leland paid off his loan in February of 1989, 3 months ahead of schedule. Corn prices had recovered to $2.90 a bushel by then, and Leland had gone back to his father's way of doing things: smaller inputs, tighter rotation, no custom cutting, no borrowed money for seed. He bought a used combine at an auction in Webster County for $3,700 and ran it for 11 years. Carol finished her treatment in the summer of 1984 and was declared in remission the following January. She lived until 2003. She never missed another planting season. Jesse graduated from Iowa State in 1990 with a degree in agricultural economics and came back to farm the same 260 acres her great-grandfather had broken in 1921. She cash rents 40 additional acres from a neighbor. She owns every piece of equipment on the place outright. Darlene Kurtz retired from Consolidated Farm Credit in 1997. She never told anyone at the bank what she had done. She didn't have to. Leland knew. Carol knew. Tom knew. Dale knew. That was enough people. At Darlene's retirement party, a cake and punch affair in the bank's break room, Gerald Fenn's replacement shook her hand and gave her a plaque. Darlene smiled, took the plaque home, and put it in a closet. On her kitchen wall, in a small frame, she kept something else. A photograph someone had taken that Sunday morning from the hill above Leland's farm. 107 tractors. A wall of smoke. A line in the mud. That was enough. Leland paid off his loan in February of 1989, 3 months ahead of schedule. Corn prices had recovered to $2.90 a bushel by then. Carol finished her treatment in the summer of 1984 and was declared in remission the following January. She lived until 2003. Jesse graduated from Iowa State in 1990 with a degree in agricultural economics and came back to farm the same 260 acres her great-grandfather had broken in 1921. Darlene Kurtz retired from Consolidated Farm Credit in 1997. She never told anyone at the bank what she had done. She didn't have to. Leland knew, Carol knew, Tom knew, Dale knew. That was enough people. And here's the thing I keep coming back to. The thing that makes this more than a story about one farm, in one county, in one bad year. It took Darlene 5 minutes to make that phone call. It took Tom 20 minutes to read the statute. It took Margaret 4 days to file the papers. And it took 107 farmers one Sunday morning to drive their tractors down a gravel road and stand in the mud and say, without saying a word, that this is not how it works. You do not take a man's home in 48 hours. You do not skip the rules because you think nobody's watching. Somebody is always watching. That 1948 Farmall H, Dale's tractor, the one with the verse from Proverbs on the hood. It's still in the family. Dale passed it to his son, Kevin, in 2001. Kevin repainted the verse. Same words, same spot on the hood. Fresh white over the rust. He drove it in the Boone County Fair Parade every July until 2019, when his daughter took over. She still drives it. The paint is always fresh. If you drive through Boone County today, you can still find Leland's farm. Jessie runs it now. The barn is new. She put it up in 2014. But the house is the same one Leland sat in that Friday night with the letter in his hands. There's a framed photograph on the wall of the front room. 107 tractors on a gravel road on a gray morning in March. You can see the smoke. You can almost hear the engines. Stories like this don't get told enough. If you know one, if your family has one, if your county has one, drop it in the comments. I read every one of them.